Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the country you were born in no longer exists. Not because of war, not because someone burned your village, but because someone, far away, decided that the name of your world was changing. Your king is no longer a king. Your gods now have to share the altar with strangers. The coins you saved your whole life are no longer accepted at the market, and the language your grandmother spoke sounds, suddenly, like something foreign to the people arriving at your gate. This is not a story about an empire being born. This is a story about 7 worlds disappearing, 7 different ways of being human, 7 different ideas about how people should live, how they should eat, how they should pray, how kings should behave, how soldiers should die, how children should grow up. 7 answers to the same question. What does it mean to build a civilization? And then, over the course of roughly 250 years, one answer erased all the others. Before we go any further, we need to sit inside the world that existed before the unification. We need to feel what normal life looked like. Because if we don't understand what was lost, we can't understand why so many people resisted the change for so long. Even when resistance was impossible. Picture the year 400 before the Common Era. You are standing in what historians will one day call the Warring States period, though no one living through it calls it that. The people living in this era do not have a name for their time. They simply have their world. And their world is made of dust roads, river markets, city walls, silk that only certain families are allowed to wear, bronze vessels that only certain clans are allowed to touch, and a sky that belongs entirely to the Son of Heaven, even when the Son of Heaven has no real power over anyone. The Zhou dynasty still exists in name, but the Zhou king, sitting in his ceremonial capital, is a symbol without an army. He performs rituals, he receives tribute that sometimes arrives and sometimes doesn't. He gives titles that nobody really needs anymore. He is a ghost wearing a crown, and everyone knows it, and everyone pretends not to notice, because the idea of the Zhou mandate still gives the world a kind of moral structure. Without the fiction of the Zhou king, there is no common language for legitimacy, and so the fiction survives long after the reality has collapsed. What actually runs the world are the 7 major states. Qin, in the dry west, with its harsh terrain and its growing obsession with efficiency and military discipline. Chu, the enormous southern kingdom, wild, forested, with its own artistic traditions so distinct from the north that scholars of a later era sometimes argued it belonged to a separate civilization entirely. Qi, the wealthy eastern state on the coast, famous for its scholars, its academies, its merchants who could calculate profit in currencies that other kingdoms hadn't invented yet. Han and Wei and Zhao, squeezed into the center of the map, fighting each other constantly over river valleys and mountain passes that none of them could afford to lose. And Yan, the cold northern kingdom, pressed against the steppe, building walls long before Qin ever thought about it, because the nomads were already real. Within each of these states, ordinary life has its own texture, its own smell, its own rhythm. In a village inside the state of Chu, a farmer wakes before dawn because the rice fields require water management that does not wait for human convenience. The irrigation channels were built by his grandfather's grandfather. He knows every bend of them. He knows which sections flood in summer and which sections run dry. This knowledge is not written anywhere. It lives in his body. It lives in the conversations he has with his father while they walk the fields at dusk. It is a form of wisdom that has no name and requires no school. His wife is already awake. She is preparing millet because rice is not yet the universal grain it will later become. The millet is ground by hand using a stone quern that has been in the family for generations. The quern has a small crack on one side that everyone knows to avoid. This small crack is part of the family's oral history. It was cracked during a flood. Which flood? A flood from before the grandmother's time. That is all anyone knows. The flood has a presence in the family's memory. even though no one can name it precisely. Their children sleep a little longer than the adults, but not much. There is always something to carry, to feed, to tend. A child in this period does not experience childhood the way a modern reader would recognize it. Play exists, but it is woven so deeply into work that distinguishing them is difficult. Children learn by doing, by watching, by being corrected, by making mistakes that have real consequences. A child who lets the ducks escape into the neighbor's field will spend the rest of the afternoon helping to retrieve them and will not do it again. The village has a headman. He is not necessarily the wealthiest person, though he is usually not the poorest either. He is the person who can hold the tension between different families without letting it become a blood feud. He knows the rules of the local shrine. He knows which ancestors require which offerings at which seasons. He knows who owes whom labor after the last harvest. His authority is informal, but it is real. And everyone understands that the village functions because he absorbs conflict before it becomes visible. Beyond the village, the nearest city is a different kind of world. Cities in the Warring States period are walled, always walled, because the distance between trade and war is never very large. The walls are made of rammed earth. Building them required enormous organized labor. The people who built them did not choose to build them. This is something that a modern person looking at ancient walls sometimes forgets. The walls were built by people who were compelled to build them, who were taken from their villages during the agricultural off-season, who were fed poorly and housed in temporary structures and expected to return home thin. Inside the walls, the market operates on a rhythm set by official decree. You cannot sell wherever you want. There are designated market zones, operating hours, and officials who inspect weights and measures. Cheating on weights is a serious offense, not because the state is deeply concerned with abstract justice, but because a functioning market requires a minimum of predictable honesty. And the state has figured out that predictable honesty requires enforcement. The goods available in a Chu city market in this period would astonish anyone who assumed ancient markets were primitive. There is silk in multiple grades and patterns, some of it dyed with colors that required elaborate chemical knowledge to produce. There is lacquerware, beautiful lacquerware, painted with designs so detailed that modern conservators examining surviving pieces sometimes need magnifying equipment to appreciate the brushwork. There is bronze, always bronze, in tools and weapons and vessels. There are medicinal plants organized by their properties. There is salt, the most important and sometimes most expensive commodity of all, because without salt, food spoils. Without salt, human bodies fail, and the salt trade is controlled by powerful interests who understand very well that they are selling something nobody can live without. Different kingdoms have different currencies. This is not merely an inconvenience. It is a philosophical fact about the world. Qin uses round coins with square holes. Other states use coins shaped like knives or spades or cloth. The shapes are not random. They reflect the history of what was traded before coinage existed. Knife money evolved in regions where blades were a common unit of exchange. Spade money evolved where agricultural tools had that role. When you carry money from one kingdom into another, you are not just exchanging financial value. You are carrying a piece of another world's history in your pocket. And this is the texture of the world before unification. A patchwork of languages that shade into each other rather than breaking cleanly. A patchwork of currencies. A patchwork of legal systems. A patchwork of ritual traditions. A patchwork of writing conventions. Even a patchwork of ideas about what the past meant. Because each state had its own historians. And each state's historians told the story of the past in ways that justified that state's present. The state of Qi traced its legitimacy back to the Duke of Zhou. The state of Chu claimed ancestry from figures so ancient they were half myth. The state of Qin was often dismissed by Eastern scholars as barely civilized, too influenced by the peoples of the Western steppe, too far from the heartland of Zhou culture to be truly sophisticated. This insult would come back to haunt the people who made it. Now let us go inside the state of Qin Because this is where the transformation begins. Qin is geographically protected. The Wei River Valley, surrounded by mountains on 3 sides, and the Yellow River to the east, creates a natural fortress. The passes that connect Qin to the east are few and defensible. This geography has an enormous effect on Qin's psychology as a state. Qin has been able to absorb reforms that would have caused revolts elsewhere. Because outsiders cannot easily intervene. When other states try to interfere with Qin's internal politics, the mountains make it expensive. In the middle of the 4th century before the Common Era, a minister named Shang Yang arrives in Qin and proposes something radical. He proposes reorganizing society from the foundations upward. Not in theory, in practice, with law, with enforcement, with a bureaucratic machinery designed to implement changes in how ordinary people live their daily lives. The reforms of Shang Yang are one of the most documented and most debated transformations in early Chinese history. But the way they are usually discussed misses something crucial: what they felt like to the people living through them. Under the old system, aristocratic families held hereditary status. You were born into a certain rank, and that rank determined nearly everything about your life: what you wore, where you sat at official gatherings, whether you could carry certain weapons, whether you could build a house of a certain height, what kind of coffin you would be buried in. The entire social world was a visible, material expression of inherited hierarchy. The clothes were the rank. The house was the rank. The ritual vessel was the rank. Shang Yang proposed replacing this with a system of merit based almost entirely on military achievement and agricultural production. Kill enough enemies in battle, and you rise in rank. Produce enough grain, and you receive recognition. Fail to produce, harbor criminals. Fail to report lawbreakers in your community, and you are punished. The entire village is responsible for each of its members. This mutual accountability, called the Baojia system in later forms, is not just a law, it is a psychological transformation. It means that your neighbors are now your overseers, and you are theirs. For the old aristocratic families of Qin, this was a catastrophe. Their status, which they had held for generations, was now conditional. A general from a good family who lost a battle would be demoted. A farmer from a poor family who killed 10 enemy soldiers in a single engagement would outrank him. This was not an abstraction. This was the world turning upside down in living memory. For ordinary Qin farmers, the reforms were complicated. On one hand, the new system offered mobility that the old system had denied them. A talented, aggressive, physically capable man from a family of no distinction could now, in theory, climb. This was intoxicating. Military service became not just a duty, but an opportunity. Qin soldiers fought differently from soldiers in other states. Contemporary accounts describe them as frightening, almost fanatical in their willingness to take risks in battle. This was partly the result of a system in which battlefield performance had direct and immediate consequences for your social standing. You were not fighting for an abstract king. You were fighting for your own future. On the other hand, the new system was relentless. The accountability mechanisms meant that ordinary people were under constant surveillance from their own communities. If your neighbor was suspected of a crime and you had not reported it, you shared in the punishment. This created a society that was effective and also, in many ways, exhausting to live in. Privacy, the luxury of minding your own business, became dangerous. The laws were written down and posted publicly. This might sound unremarkable to a modern reader, but it was radical. In most ancient societies, including most ancient Chinese states, law was partly customary and partly aristocratic knowledge. Judges and officials interpreted tradition, and their interpretations had enormous latitude. Writing the law down and posting it in public spaces did not eliminate corruption or bias, but it created a reference point that ordinary people could use to challenge officials. It created, for the first time, something like legal predictability. Shang Yang himself did not survive his own reforms. After the death of his patron, He was accused by the aristocratic families he had dispossessed and executed in a particularly brutal manner. But the system he created survived him because it worked. Qin won battles. Qin expanded its territory. Qin could field larger and better organized armies than any rival state. The system that felt like a cage to the people inside it was, by the ruthless measure of the period, producing results. Over the following century, Qin continued expanding while the other 6 states spent enormous energy fighting each other. The strategic logic of the period created a kind of tragedy of cooperation. Every time 2 states allied against Qin, their own rivalry undermined the alliance. Every time a state thought about making peace with Qin to recover its strength, another state would accuse it of treachery. Qin played these divisions expertly. The diplomacy of Qin in the century before unification is one of the great underappreciated stories of political strategy in the ancient world. Qin did not simply conquer. Qin isolated, divided, corrupted, and then conquered. The people living through this period experienced it as a slow darkening. If you were born in the state of Han in the year 300 before the Common Era, you grew up with a world that seemed stable, or at least stable enough. There were wars on the borders, but there had always been wars on the borders. The market still functioned. The harvest still mattered. The ancestors still received their offerings. By the time you were 40, the borders had shifted significantly. Some of your family's fields were now technically in Qin territory, even though the fields looked exactly the same. Some of the officials who collected taxes were new people, Qin appointees, who spoke with accents that marked them as outsiders. The coins they accepted were different. The registers they kept were organized differently. By the time you were 60, Han as a political entity was gone. It had been absorbed by Qin in the year 230 before the Common Era. The kingdom that had existed for centuries, that had its own history and its own traditions, and its own sense of itself, ceased to exist as a political fact. What remained was a territory, administered by Qin, populated by people who remembered a different world, but had no institutional mechanism for preserving it. This pattern repeated itself 6 times. Zhao fell in 228, Wei in 225, Chu in 223, Yan in 222, Qi, the last to fall, in 221. Qi's fall is particularly striking because Qi had tried a different strategy. Qi had avoided direct military confrontation with Qin for decades. Qi's ruling family, the Tian clan, believed that diplomacy and economic sophistication could preserve the state where military resistance had failed the others. Qi was wealthy and cultivated. It was the home of the famous Jixia Academy, where scholars from across the known world gathered to debate philosophy, governance, astronomy, medicine, and nearly every other domain of human inquiry. Han believed its intellectual culture was a form of strength. When Qin finally turned its armies toward Qi, the military response was almost non-existent. Qi had not maintained its armies at the level required. The sophistication that its ruling class had taken such pride in had not translated into the kind of cold organizational efficiency that Qin had spent a century perfecting. Qi fell quickly, and the scholars of the Jixia Academy found themselves subjects of a king who had no particular reverence for the tradition they represented. The man who united China was Yingzheng, who became the first emperor, the Qin Shi Huang, at the age of 38. His personal history is extraordinary even by the standards of an extraordinary period. He became king of Qin at the age of 13, after a childhood spent as a political hostage in the state of Zhao. He grew up watching his family's enemies from inside their territory. He learned very early that survival required a kind of constant vigilance that never entirely relaxes. He ruled for 25 years before the final conquest, and during that time, he was the target of at least 3 assassination attempts that we know of, and probably others that were never recorded. The assassin sent by the state of Yan came so close that he lunged for the emperor with a poisoned dagger and grabbed the emperor's sleeve. The emperor, unable to draw his own sword in the panic, ran around a pillar while his ministers stood frozen with terror. because court protocol forbade them from carrying weapons in the imperial presence. A physician threw his medical bag at the attacker to slow him down long enough for the emperor to finally pull his sword free. These are the kinds of details that official history sometimes preserves accidentally, and they tell us something about how close the world came to a completely different outcome. The decision to call himself not king but emperor, Huangdi, was conscious and deliberate. The word he chose for himself combined two older terms for sacred and powerful rulers, creating something that had not existed before. A title for someone who claimed to stand above the entire world, not just above other kings. He abolished the feudal titles that the other states had used. He divided the entire unified territory into 36 commanderies, administered by appointed officials who could be dismissed and replaced, not hereditary lords who held their positions by birth. This was the most radical administrative change in Chinese history to that point. He standardized the writing system. This is the reform that most people mention first when they list what Qin unification accomplished. And it deserves careful attention because its effects were profound in ways that go beyond the obvious. The 7 states had used variants of the same writing system, but the variants were significant enough that a document written in Qi could be difficult for an official in Qin to read fluently. Standardization meant that the administrative apparatus of the empire could function across territories that were linguistically diverse. Spoken languages and dialects continued to differ enormously, and they still do in the regions that were once these separate states. But written language became a unifying thread that allowed a shared textual culture to develop. And that culture would eventually become one of the most persistent features of what we call Chinese civilization. He standardized weights and measures. He standardized axle widths so that carts could travel without difficulty on roads built in different regions. He built roads, enormous roads, radiating from the capital at Xianyang, connecting the empire's administrative centers. The road building required compelled labor on a massive scale. The people who built the roads experienced them not as progress, but as an imposition. They were taken from their villages, sometimes for years. Some of them never came back. He ordered the collection and destruction of weapons held by private citizens. The bronze from the collected weapons was melted down and cast into enormous statues placed in front of the imperial palace. This was practical, in that it reduced the material available for rebellion. But it was also symbolic, in a way that the people watching the statues being installed would have understood immediately. The bronze that had been the property of the people, that had circulated through their communities in the form of tools and weapons and vessels, was now concentrated in the capital, transformed into monuments to imperial power. He ordered the burning of books. This is the moment that receives the most attention and the most condemnation in later Chinese historical writing. And it deserves careful examination rather than simple horror. The order was primarily directed at texts that supported alternative political theories, histories of the other states that could serve as resources for those states' revived identities, and philosophical works that criticized Qin's legalist approach to governance. It was not total. Medical texts, agricultural texts, divinatory texts were exempted. But it was real. And it happened, and a significant amount of what the other 6 states had written about themselves was destroyed. The people who felt this most acutely were the scholars. In the world before unification, scholars had remarkable mobility. If you were a philosopher or a strategist whose ideas fell out of favor in one state, you could move to another. The 7 states competed not just militarily, but intellectually. And that competition created a space for ideas that no single ruler fully controlled. This is part of why the Warring States period, despite all its violence, produced such extraordinary intellectual creativity. Confucius had traveled between states trying to find a ruler who would implement his ideas. Mencius had done the same. The Taoist writers, the Mohists, the legalists, the strategists who wrote about war and diplomacy, all of them had benefited from a world in which there were multiple audiences for ideas. Under empire, there was one audience, and the emperor had very specific ideas about which ideas were useful. It is important to be honest about what unification also brought. The ending of the wars was real. For ordinary people who had spent their lives in states that were permanently mobilized, paying taxes to fund armies, and losing family members to campaigns that sometimes seemed to have no purpose other than preventing the neighbor state from growing stronger. The end of the wars was not nothing. The exhaustion of the warring states period was real. Soldiers who had survived returned to farms that had been neglected. Women who had managed households alone for years while husbands served in armies now had their husbands back, or received the news that the husbands were not coming back. The end of warfare was something that millions of people had wanted for generations. The empire also connected things. The merchant from what had been Wei could now travel to what had been Qi without crossing a border, without changing currencies, without negotiating the suspicion that foreigners routinely faced. The standardized roads made travel faster. The standardized writing made communication more reliable. These were genuine improvements in the conditions of daily life for some people in some circumstances. But the first Qin emperor's reign lasted only 11 years. He died in 210, on a journey, which was perhaps fitting for a man who never stopped moving. He died without having resolved the fundamental tension at the heart of his empire. He had created a system powerful enough to conquer the world, and he had no idea how to govern it in peace. The system of Qin was designed for war. Its bureaucracy, its laws, its system of compelled labor, its surveillance mechanisms, all of it had been optimized for a state that needed to mobilize its population for constant military expansion. When expansion ended, the mobilization didn't stop. The compelled labor that had been building the Great Wall continued. The road building continued. The construction of the emperor's enormous tomb complex, which employed hundreds of thousands of workers over decades, continued. The taxes that funded all of this continued. But the victories that had made these impositions feel like part of something larger, like participation in a great project, the victories were over. What remained was just the weight. The rebellions that destroyed the Qin dynasty began less than 4 years after the emperor's death. They began in many places simultaneously, which tells us something important. The discontent was not created by the rebellions. The discontent was already there, waiting. When a group of soldiers, delayed by rain and facing execution under Qin's extremely unforgiving laws for tardiness, decided they had nothing to lose by revolting, they found almost immediately that thousands of other people had been waiting for exactly this permission to act. The men who led the final destruction of Qin were not from the old aristocracies. One of them, Liu Bang, was a minor Qin official from a farming family who had enforced the very laws he eventually helped overthrow. He understood Qin's system from the inside, and one of his first acts after capturing the Qin capital was to announce that he was abolishing most of it. The three-clause code he proclaimed, which reduced the entire apparatus of Qin law to 3 simple prohibitions against killing, robbery, and injury, was a political masterstroke precisely because it was so simple. After a generation of Qin's relentless legal machinery, simplicity felt like liberation. The empire that Liu Bang founded, the Han dynasty, kept many of Qin's structural innovations while abandoning the harshest features of its rule. The commandery system of administration survived. The standardized writing system survived. The idea that the emperor stood above all kings survived. What changed was the texture of daily life under that system. Han governance was, relatively speaking, lighter on ordinary people. Taxes were reduced. The compelled labor demands were scaled back. Confucian ideas about governance, which emphasized the moral obligations of rulers toward their subjects, began to influence how the court justified its authority. But here is what did not come back. The 7 worlds. The state of Chu, with its distinct southern culture and its wild artistic sensibility, its shamanic religious traditions, its particular relationship with the rivers and forests of the south. That world existed now only in fragments, in the memories of old people and in literary texts that managed to survive. The state of Qi, with its cosmopolitan merchant culture and its famous academy where every idea had once been welcome, existed now only as a geographic region within an empire that had decided which ideas were worth preserving. The state of Yan, the cold northern kingdom that had been building walls against the steppe for centuries before anyone else thought to do it, existed now as part of a borderland administered by officials sent from the capital. The diversity of the warring states period, the intellectual competition, the multiple currencies, the multiple ways of imagining the past, the multiple answers to the question of how people should live, most of that was gone. What replaced it was one answer, one system, one writing, one past that was told in one way. China, as a concept, as an identity, was born, and its birth required the death of everything that had refused to become it. This is where history becomes genuinely difficult to hold in one's hands, because what was lost was real, and what was gained was also real. The people who lived through the end of the Seven Kingdoms were not experiencing an abstraction. They were experiencing their grandfather's language becoming the wrong language, their local gods becoming secondary to the official gods, their family's way of organizing a meal becoming a regional eccentricity rather than simply the way meals are organized. They were experiencing the particular grief of discovering that normal, the thing they had always assumed was simply the way the world was in fact a choice that someone else could unmake. History remembers the emperor and his armies. History remembers the wall and the roads and the terracotta soldiers buried in the dark beneath the earth, their faces each subtly different from every other face, as if the craftsmen who made them insisted on preserving in clay the individuality that the empire was busy erasing above ground. But the people who actually lived through this transformation left almost no direct record. They left the marks of their existence in the soil, in the artifacts that archaeologists patiently excavate, in the administrative documents written on bamboo strips that occasionally survive in tombs. They left the shapes of their daily choices in the genetic record of their descendants. They did not leave diaries. They did not leave manifestos. They left only the evidence that they existed, and that they tried to continue existing, and that the world they were trying to continue existing in kept changing faster than any of them could fully understand. The farmer in what had been Chu, who watched new officials arrive to take his census and speak to him in an accent he barely understood, he kept farming. The fields were the same. The rice still needed water. The seasons still turned. He built his accommodation with the new world not out of enthusiasm, but out of the fundamental human drive to continue. He found ways to maintain, quietly, some of the practices that mattered to him. He made offerings at the local shrine even when the new administration preferred different rituals. He told his children the old stories, filtered through his memory of what the old stories had been, already beginning to blur. And in this, he was doing something that every conquered people in history has done. He was finding the space between compliance and survival, and living in that space as fully as he could. The story of why ancient China stopped being seven kingdoms is ultimately not a story about military conquest, or administrative genius, or imperial ambition, though it is about all of those things. It is a story about what happens when the enormous diversity of human solutions to the problem of living together gets sorted, violently and permanently, into a single solution. It is a story about what efficiency costs. It is a story about what order requires. The people who built China did not know they were building China. They knew they were fighting, or farming, or arguing about philosophy, or trying to keep their family fed through another winter. The empire was the consequence of their lives, not the container they were placed inside. The container came later, imposed by people who had decided that one answer was better than seven, and who had the armies to enforce that decision. We look back now, and we call it unification. We say it as if it were a natural process, like water finding its level, like things that belong together coming together. But the people on the ground in 230 before the Common Era, watching Qin armies cross into Han territory, watching the Han king surrender, watching the new officials arrive with their standardized weights and their unfamiliar accents, they did not experience it as completion. They experienced it as ending. They experienced it as the world they had always lived in contracting, suddenly and irrevocably, into something smaller than it had been. The world they had known, a world of 7 answers, became a world of 1. And from that one, everything that followed grew. If this was what disappeared when China became one empire, then the next question that haunts everything that came after it is this: what did the survivors carry forward, hidden inside the new world they were forced to inhabit? And how did it eventually find its way back to the surface?